Hey, I have a second channel. Cube Comp MTDX. Hey everybody. So here's another video about power supplies. And tonight I'm going to be talking about whether or not it's a good idea to reuse an existing power supply if you're doing a new build, or let's say if you're doing an upgrade on your existing build. Should you replace the power supply in it, or should you keep the existing one in the system? So I'm actually going to talk about that part first. So let's say you have a computer that you've built in the past and you're looking to upgrade it to a new setup, and you're wondering, is the existing power supply going to be okay, or should I go ahead and just buy a new power supply unit and install it? So that is, really, to be honest, here's what I think about that. So it all depends on the power supply itself, and also the kind of hardware you're going from. So let's say you built a high-end system 10 years ago. The power supply unit used, let's say it's a newer unit that's, well, I'm going to say from 10 years ago. Let's say it's active PSU. Let's say it's got plenty of capacity on the 12-volt rail. Sure, I don't see why it would be a bad idea to reuse that power supply, provided it's a decent quality unit. You just have to keep in mind the power requirements of your new build, and if your existing power supply can meet those requirements, then I'd say it'd be fine. But again, another thing is to mention is you have to consider the quality of the existing power supply. If it's a high-end unit, like let's say like a Thermaltake or a Corsair, Seasonic, one of them decent brands, then sure. But if it was a real cheap budget model power supply, you might want to be careful, because low-end power supplies in particular, cheap-end units, not only do they falsify their ratings, but they use inferior quality components, and a lot of times they actually skimp out on components and actually bypass the use of certain components altogether. You may have seen videos of me upgrading these cheap-end supplies, but I'll never use them to power a high-end system. Like for example, let's say if I was to upgrade the Mid-Tower Lux tomorrow, it has a Thermaltake Smart 750M power supply. I think it's either that or Smart M750, something like that. It's a modular 750 watt power supply from 2013. So the power supply is actually a little bit older than the hardware that's in it now. The Mid-Tower Lux has a Ryzen 7 1700X processor, 32 gigs of RAM. It's got a Radeon RX 550 graphics card. It's got 4 hard disk drives, got an M.2 drive, you name it. Definitely not quite pushing that 70 watt power supply. I could probably run that with a 450 watt supply, to be honest. And that's because the graphics card, for example, does not require external power. So the power supply was put in again in 2013. Back then it was powering an AMD FX 8120 processor that was overclocked to 4.2 GHz, 125 watt TDP processor at stock. It was powering a Radeon HD 6750 graphics card, which did in fact require a 6-pin power connection. So the previous gen Mid-Tower Lux was a bit more power hungry than the current Ryzen setup. So in that case, the existing power supply, considering it was a decent quality unit, I just carried it over into the current build, and it's been working just fine. But let's say the computer in question was built, I don't know, 2006, 2007, and let's say the power supply is a 350 watt unit or a 400 watt unit. We'll use this power supply here for example, because this power supply is from that era. This is actually a off-the-shelf replacement supply from Best Buy. It's a 400 watt power supply manufactured by Hunke, and one thing about it is it does offer some decent 12 volt power. It has 2 12 volt rails of 14 amps and 15 amps. It does not say the combined power on those, but this unit does seem to put out a lot more power on the plus 3.3 and plus 5 volt rails. And of course, modern PCs need the majority of everything on the plus 12 volt rail. So, a brand new 400 watt supply, brand new 400 watt power supply that's built to modern specs with pretty much everything being on a 12 volt rail, you would actually be able to utilize more of that 400 watts than, let's say, an old unit like this, which I guess I would say would be more equivalent of a 350 watt supply today. Now, there was actually some power supplies from this era that were built to supply more of their power on the plus 12. So I'm going to put a card up in the upper right corner of the video right here. This is to a video I shot last year. It's what all you need to know about ATX power supplies. I recommend you watch it if you're not familiar about power supplies and how much they've changed over the years. And in that video I talk about how, let's say, a 400 watt power supply from today is way different than a 400 watt power supply that was made in 2001, for example. So you have to consider where the outputs of the power supply go. Do they go mainly to the plus 3.3 volt rail or the plus 5 volt rail, or do they go to the plus 12 volt rail like modern computers need? So one thing to definitely keep in mind. So that being said, let's say you're building a system from scratch. You're on a budget and you've budgeted most of your money toward the motherboard, the CPU, and things like that. Let's say, for example, you decide to go on a budget and build a Ryzen APU setup. Like, for example, that computer I just built, the Q Computer Portacube and the XQ Pack 2 case. So, in that system, I have the Ryzen 5 5600G APU, and I'm utilizing the integrated iGPU, the Radeon graphics, and not using a separate video card. 16 gigs of RAM, a single hard drive, one optical drive, M.2 SSD. Pretty basic in a computer. So, for example, that power supply back there in the corner, that is a Bestech ATX 25012Z. That unit could actually run that. Now, I went with the Bestech ATX 312E, which is the little bit newer eMachines model. And it runs it just fine. So, I guess my point here is, let's say you're on a budget and you're building a system like the specs I just mentioned. You could do one of two things. You could buy that $20 power supply from Newegg or Amazon or eBay that has an inferior design, or probably a very dated design, probably like half bridge or something like that. It has a minus 5 volt rail, has a 2 transistor 5 volt standby rail, it's missing EMI filtering components. Or you could use an existing OEM supply like this right here, which the Bestech units, there was one you definitely want to avoid, and that's the Bestech ATX 25012E out of the eMachine systems, because those had a faulty design with the bad 2 transistor 5 volt standby rail, and also prone to running hot and cooking the capacitors and causing that 2 transistor 5 volt standby rail to go rogue and fry motherboards. That's one unit you would avoid, but the other Bestechs, aside from some capacitor issues, these were pretty dang reliable units. Now, I actually do have electronics knowledge, and I have gone through and repaired these things. The most common thing I do to them is I replace capacitors. But there are other power supplies out there from other brands, like Hypro, Lite-On, and others, that are just built extremely well. Some of them are not the most efficient, but they're built extremely well. So, I've built a whole fleet of Ryzen 3 and Ryzen 5 APU setups using existing towers, some of them having this model power supply, some of them having the equivalent Hypro 250 watt unit, some of them having the Bestech ATX 312E, units like that. And to my knowledge, I forget exactly how many of those I built. I built those from, let's see, I think the first one I built was in 2018, and I think the last one I built for the company was 2020. And to my knowledge, they've all been running just fine. I think some of them did get, I think they did add some additional computers from a different supplier afterwards. I don't know for sure, but to my knowledge, those machines are still going, and they haven't had any major issues out of them. So, If you're on a budget and you're building a system that does not require a whole lot of power, you could definitely get by with one of these units here. A unit like this. This would actually be better than a cheap-end power supply that, like I mentioned, skimped on design, uses a really dated design, and just overall is not exactly a safe unit. These units here, aside from that one bad model from Best Tech, they're pretty dang reliable. I mean, to my knowledge, I don't think I've ever gotten a system in that had something that was fried due to the power supply unit. One of these. I mean, sometimes these things do have capacitors go bad, and usually what happens is it just simply quits. The unit simply quits working. It doesn't actually do any damage to the computer when that happens. If you're on a budget and you're, let's say you don't have much money to spend on a power supply, by all means go with something like this. You may have a computer sitting around from many years ago, and it may have one of these, but I should mention that a unit like this, of course, you can see this power supply has no SATA connections. And the thing is, when I use a unit like this in a budget build, I either have to use Molex's SATA adapters, or I actually splice in SATA power leads off of other power supplies I've junked. So that's another thing to consider. So here's an example of a cheap end unit. It's not terrible, but it's not that great. It actually does have full EMI filtering, it has surge protection and all that good stuff, but it's an old dated half bridge design. So this is a 300 watt power supply that can put out less amperage on the plus 12 volt rail than this 250 watt Bestech. Put them side by side, that way you can look. See, this Bestech here has a 14 amp 12 volt rail. This 300 watt supply, or at least it claims to be 300 watts, has just 12 volts available on its, 12 amps, excuse me, 12 amps available on its 12 volt rail. So, yeah. So, you can see this one, you look at this one, the plus 5 is 20 amps. Heck, the plus 5 on this Bestech is 25. I don't think this is a 300 watt power supply. I think this is more of a 200 watt power supply. I think they're just lying on that. I think they are just absolutely lying on that 300 watt rating there. Yeah. Yeah, you put these side by side and it's like, wow, look at this. So, yeah, something to definitely consider. These cheap end units, they tend to lie on their ratings. So I would not suggest running something like this in a new build. So, I mean, and this unit here is much heavier, for sure. See, like I mentioned, the Bestech units, I mean, this is one example, but I could look up here on my shelf of power supply units, and I could pull in there a couple of good examples. I mean, Acer systems tend to have these FSP units, which have plenty of SATA connections, so you could drop this right in to a new build if you wanted to. And this is actually just a 250 watt supply. No, it's a 300 watt supply. So I mean, it would run a low end build pretty decently, I think. So I got a Bestech 312Z. That one has a 19 amp 12 volt rail. There's a 312V has a 15 amp 12 volt rail. That's the unit I used in the Ryzen 5 5600G build, and it runs it perfectly fine. Power supply doesn't even seem stressed at all. Another good unit is the Hypro HP D3057F3R. These sometimes have issues with caps failing, but if you have electronics knowledge, you can actually recap one of those, and they make awesome power supplies. They're spec for 300 watts, but they've been load tested to 400 watts before. Just to put in perspective how powerful those things are, or how durable they are. I know I'm kind of getting all over the place here, but let's say if you're building a new system, is it safe to carry over the existing power supply in the existing build? Like I say, it depends on what you have. You got to look at what the unit can put out on its ratings, and you got to, of course, make sure it's a decent power supply. If it's a cheap end unit, I would definitely consider replacing it. If it's a decent high end unit, sure, carry it over provided it meets its specs. Let's say you're building a budget system and you don't have much money to spend on a power supply. Definitely consider pulls from older OEM systems, because these units, like this one here, for example, aside from capacitors, which a lot of power supplies do tend to have capacitors used with time, depending on what brand of capacitors they use. But these units, aside from that, they're built pretty dang well. And although they're not 80 plus efficient, I've heard some of these units getting 78% efficiency. So if you don't have much money to spend, even if it's something temporary to throw in until you can get enough money to spend on a new power supply, you could use something like this. And like I mentioned, you'd have to use some, of course, the Molex and SATA adapters. But of course, keep in mind, for example, a 300 watt power supply from 10 years ago may not be the same as a brand new 300 watt supply. Basically, what I mean by that is where it puts that 300 watts. Where does it put it out at? Does it put it out on the 5 volt rail, or does it put it out on the 12 volt rail? In addition to a lack of SATA connections on older power supplies, you'll likely also find that they are using a 20 pin motherboard connection instead of a 24 pin motherboard connection. Now, if your motherboard is running a PCIe graphics card, I generally would recommend using a 24 pin connection. And they actually make adapters out there that adapt a 20 to 24 pin, but the thing about those is I don't really think those will make much of a difference, considering you're still running a 20 pin supply. In the case that you're running a really low, if you're running a really low end PCIe graphics card, that 20 pin connection should do you fine. But if you're running a PCIe graphics card that pulls a moderate to high end amount of power off of the motherboard, in other words, it does not have its external power connection, then you definitely do want to use 24 pin connections. And also, older power supplies typically do not have an 8 pin EPS 12 connection, or less a CPU power connection. Generally, you can get by with a 4 pin connection as long as your processor TDP is 95 watts or less. If your processor is, let's say it's 125 watts or more than that, you definitely want to have something that has built into the unit an 8 pin connection, and I wouldn't suggest using an adapter for that, because like the 20 to 24 pin adapter, you're not really competent much of anything. So even moderate power supplies from 10 to 12 years ago, sometimes they will be missing, not missing, but they won't have the EPS 12 volt connection. They'll just have the classic HX 12 volt connection here, like you see right there. So something else to keep in mind. So anyways, that's my opinions on whether or not you should reuse your power supply when you're doing a rebuild of your system, or should you use an existing power supply when doing a budget build, or should you just buy a cheap end power supply? And again, I definitely would not recommend buying a cheap end power supply if you're doing even a moderate build, because, like for example, that Ryzen 5 5600G build I just did, not including the cost of the case, I spent about $500 on the hardware, and that was for everything except for the hard drive and the DVD drive. Those I already had, and also the RAM that I purchased went into the mid-tower Lux. So we're going to say about $475, something like that is what I spent. The last thing I want to do is be running that with a really cheap end power supply of questionable quality. I would trust something like this far more than a cheap end thing like that over there. So anyways, hope y'all enjoyed this video. Thanks for watching. Well everybody, that wraps it up for this video, and I hope you enjoyed it.
If you did, please like the video. Also, don't forget to subscribe to keep your channel, and be sure to tick that bell so you'll get notified when new videos are posted. Also, don't forget I have a whole lot of other interesting videos here on the channel to check out. And also, in addition, I have a second channel, CubeCompMTDX, where I have all sorts of other videos not exactly related to technology. Links to the channels are available at the end of this video. Again, I thank you for your support and thanks for watching this video.